All right, so in this section, we're going to get a little bit into Aristotle and Greek culture. I'm not an expert in Aristotle, but I'll do my best with this. Just recall, Dewey was writing at a particular time in history. I think some of his criticisms later on, not so much in this next section, but as we get further along in the chapter, will be more acceptable to people nowadays than they may have been when Dewey was writing. Anyway, let's begin this section about Aristotle. So, Greek culture, Dewey says, was extraordinarily rich in artistic accomplishment. It is noted also for acute and varied observations of natural phenomena and for comprehensive generalizations of what was observed. So, of course, we have a deep respect for the accomplishments of Greek culture, some great art, and very careful observations of nature. Medicine, music, and astronomy, meteorology, language, and political institutions were all studied with the means at command in ways freer from external control than was the case in any previous civilization. So, this is an interesting kind of historical, sociological point. I mean, not an original point, but something that people have definitely thought about. Why was ancient Greek culture somewhat freer, politically freer than, as Dewey says, previous civilizations? And there seem to be kind of, partly technological reasons for that, political reasons, and so on, having just to do with the development of human society by that time and various kind of serendipitous things that took place in that particular part of the world, which we don't really need to go into, but it's just an interesting kind of fact of history that ancient Greece at this time involved, at least for certain kinds of people, right? Not everyone, of course, but certain kinds of people had a greater kind of freedom to pursue different theories, different ways of looking at the world, and so on. Moreover, the special results in these varied fields were welded into that single comprehensive view which, following the Greek example, has ever since gone by the name of philosophy. So this single comprehensive view, which we call philosophy, especially notable is the fact that, in the absence of the later sharp division between subject and object, psychology was a science applied to biology, which in turn was allied. Psychology was a science allied to biology, which in turn was allied to physics, while morals and politics were parts of theory of nature. So it was a fairly naturalistic view in which there was not great distinctions between psychology and biology and physics. And morals and politics were part of theory of nature. And in a way, this is close to Dewey's own view. He also does not see sharp divisions between all of these things and has a naturalistic view of things like morality and politics and human society and all of that. But of course, there's going to be some differences, largely, I think, because of the development of science after the Greeks. So there's going to be some differences between Dewey and the Greeks, despite probably some compatibilities. So Dewey writes that man was conceived in relation to nature, not as something set apart. And of course, that's very Deweyan. Moral and political studies were not separated by sharp boundaries from cosmology. Mathematics, moreover, was thought to be an existential science. We might say empirical science. Because of these facts, the conception that was entertained of nature as a whole became the finally decisive consideration. One does not have to go into controversies that have arisen regarding the meaning of the word nature as used by the early scientist philosophers to be aware that earlier meanings finally bifurcated into two significant directions. So nature as bifurcating, right? Two different meanings which we're going to be introduced to. Physis, I believe that's kind of the right pronunciation. I may be wrong. Ancient Greek is not my specialty. But physis, the word translated as nature, is etymologically connected with a root meaning to grow. Now, growth is change. It is coming into being and passing out of being, altering between the two extremes of birth and death. So growth between birth and death, right? You're born, you grow, then you die. The adjective physical was employed by Aristotle to designate this aspect of nature, this growing, changing aspect of nature, is what Aristotle is talking about with physics, with the physical. The physical was not set over against the mental and psychical, for these were also physical in the sense of being marked by change. Nowadays, in the last, I don't know, however many hundreds of years, but since Aristotle, we have tended to make a distinction between the physical and the mental, or the physical and the psychical. But that is not the distinction or the contrary that Aristotle is positing here. It's going to be the changing and the unchanging. So we need to be clear about that. But as we speak today of the nature of things, so nature in its most emphatic and eulogistic sense consisted of unchanging substances with their fixed essential characters or natures. Yeah, so these two different meanings of nature. So the distinction and relation of the permanent, the fixed, from and to the variable and changing was the ultimate problem of science and philosophy. And these two aspects of what we now call nature, so nature as something constantly changing, but also we talk about the nature of a thing, which is its kind of unchanging essence. And then how do those things relate, right? So the philosophy of Aristotle is a systematic exposition and organized solution of this problem carried through all subjects with which inquiry was then concerned. So the philosophy of Aristotle is just exploring this problem of the relation of the changing and unchanging through all subject matters which people were interested in back then. I should mention also this kind of two kinds of nature here would also, I think, we could apply the labels of metaphysics and physics. So that comes partly out of Aristotle, of course. Aristotle had his physics, and he also had his metaphysics. Physics was about, these things that change. Metaphysics was about being qua being, as philosophers say, as what is universal or eternal, what does not change, what is essential. This basic fact has a fundamental connection with Aristotelian logic, and we're going to be concerned here with Aristotelian logic, but as Dewey explained or argued earlier in this book, you can't separate metaphysics from logic. You can't separate people's metaphysical views from the kind of logic that they hold. So this basic fact has a fundamental connection with Aristotelian logic. On the negative side, this logic was not formal in the sense in which forms are independent of existential subject matter. So Dewey has already mentioned that mathematics for the Greeks was an existential science. So it's not just kind of a pure realm of numbers without application to existence. And this is maybe a more broader way of saying that. I mean, mathematics is one small part. But more generally, logic was not separate from existence. And again, this is a little bit more Deweyan. And, this seems to be accurate. I don't know what Aristotle experts would say about this. If Dewey is, making Aristotle more Deweyan, then maybe he was, I don't know, or maybe Dewey is more Aristotelian than he thought he was. But certainly Dewey had a great deal of respect for Aristotle, but he wants to kind of update this because of changes in what we have learned about the world through new kinds of scientific inquiry, et cetera, et cetera. We've talked about that before. So, so logic was not formal in the sense in which forms are independent of existential subject matter, as some logicians in Dewey's time would see logic as independent of existence. It was formal, but the forms were those of existence, insofar as existence is known as distinct from being merely sensed or discursively thought about or an object of guess and opinion. And there's an important conceptual distinction in Aristotle between form and matter, and these are never totally separate. In Aristotle, which is maybe a bit kind of different from Plato. So this is the sense in which forms are not totally independent of existential subject matter, because things to exist need form to be known needs to be in something that exists. I think that's the idea. Again, I'm no expert on Aristotle. Yeah, and then we'll deal with knowledge kind of as we go through this chapter. Kind of what knowledge is for Aristotle, for the ancient Greeks, is going to be a little bit complicated to say in relation to Dewey's own philosophy. So, yeah, but this issue of as insofar as existence is known, this is going to be important as well. That the significance of the words subject and object has undergone reversal in the history of philosophic thought is a well-known fact. What we call objects were in Greek terminology subjects. So like things in the world that you can talk about, basically, that can be known. Greek terminology calls those subjects. Now we tend to call them objects, as in like object of inquiry or an object of science or something. And it's makes more sense if you think about the grammatical terms of subject and object. So subject in grammar is just something that's being talked about. It's not necessarily something that has subjectivity. Nowadays, when we talk about subject, we tend to think about someone who has agency or subjectivity or something like that, which is not what we're talking about here. Just talking about something that can be studied, talked about, something that exists. What we call objects, the Greeks called subjects. They were existences taken in their status as subject matter of knowledge, right? Things that could be known. Or another way to look at it is what today we call subject matter, and Dewey, there's a big, one of Dewey's favorite words is subject matter, the subject matter of inquiry, which other philosophers might call the object of inquiry. So it gets confusing. They're logical forms. The logical forms of the Greek subjects were determined by the basic division supposed to exist in nature between the changing and the eternal. Things that change are too unstable to be subjects of knowledge in its exact and complete sense. Knowledge, as distinct from sense and opinion, is fixed. Truth does not alter. And this is maybe one big difference between the Greek view and the kind of modern or Deweyan view, is that this idea that truth does not alter, knowledge is knowledge of something fixed, something complete. Otherwise, you're dealing with something less than knowledge for the ancient Greeks, for Aristotle, whereas this is not necessarily the case for Dewey. Hence, its subjects, or objects in our sense, must also be invariable. So the subjects of knowledge must be invariable. Seen from this point of view, nature presented the scientific mind with an ordered grade or hierarchy of qualitative things from emptiness up to being in its full sense. So from nothing to being are all those things presented to the scientific mind. That which truly is cannot change. So the real, really real thing is the thing that doesn't change, cannot change. The existence of change is thus proof of lack of complete being, of what the Greeks sometimes called, because of emphasis upon lack of substantiality, non-being. So the changeable is what is sometimes called non-being, in this contradistinction to being, which is the unchanging, that which cannot change. The various grades of intellectual apprehension corresponded, with their logical forms, point for point, with the graded ranking of subjects in their qualitative degrees of being. Yeah, so knowledge in its kind of highest form was knowledge of, full being, complete being, what does not change. And then you have lesser degrees of knowledge, or maybe intellectual apprehension, to kind of keep this kind of separation of perfect knowledge from other things, because the lesser degrees of intellectual apprehension were accorded to things that changed in various ways, more or less, to things with more or less stable existence. Idiomatic speech today often uses the words whole and perfect as synonyms, in contradistinction to the broken, the partial, and imperfect. It is not too much to say that the implications of the identifications and the distinctions involved were determinative of Greek cosmology and theory of being. So Dewey is speculating here that this distinction between whole and broken, perfect, imperfect, kind of determined how the Greeks thought about the world. Greek culture, in its characteristic attitudes, was definitely aesthetic. Works of art are qualitative wholes. Pieces of them are merely physical. So a piece of a work of art is not necessarily a work of art. And so the Greeks here, he's saying, had an aesthetic view of things, in that they viewed the whole, the perfect, as the highest form of existence. The Greek urn, as well as the Greek statue and temple, were works of art, complete and, as we still say, finished. Measure, fixed limits, fixed ratio, and proportions are the mark of everything that truly is, right? For the Greeks, that is. So what can be measured, what has limits, what has a perfect ratio, a fixed ratio or proportion. These are definitive of what has true existence. Such objects, or subjects, as the Greeks would say, are substances having design and form in an objective sense. Change and susceptibility to variation lack, on the other hand, measure. This idea of having a measurable form, a perfected form, with a certain proportion, a certain ratio. Change lacks that, right? They are marks of the presence of the indefinite. So change, susceptibility to variation are marks of the presence of the indefinite. The finite, finished, and complete are such because of fixed limits and measure. Change as such escapes intellectual apprehension. So change as change is kind of beyond knowledge, cannot be known, escapes intellectual apprehension. We get a degree of intellectual apprehension to the extent that there is something persistent through change. And of course, the highest form of knowledge is of that which is perfectly stable, which does not change. So change as such escapes intellectual apprehension. It can be known only insofar as it can be included within fixed boundaries, which mark its beginning and its objective end, or close. That is, as far as change tends to move toward a final and unchanging limit, right? As far as it goes to something that can be recognized as a stable endpoint. Change is known, in other words, only as it is enclosed within fixed limits, right? With a beginning, end, a birth, a death. From the side of knowledge and logical forms, the changing is sensible, particular, or partial, while the measured whole, defined by limits, is the rational. So Dewey mentioned earlier things which are merely sensible, which for the Greeks were not subjects of knowledge, while the rational, the whole, is, that which is within limits, is what can be known according to the eulogistic sense of knowledge, as Dewey would say, or the emphatic sense of knowledge. The syllogism is the form of complete enclosure. It is of two types. In one, that which is enclosed as well as the limiting and enclosing is permanent. Let me try that again. So it is of two types. So the syllogism is of two types, right? In one, that which is enclosed as well as the limiting and enclosing is permanent. In the other, that which is held within bounds is itself in process of change or is physical, not rational. So two types of syllogism that we're going to deal with next. So syllogisms dealing with that which is permanent and that which is not permanent, which is changeable. And this last section here has been fairly technical, right? A little bit difficult to make sense of, especially if you're not that experienced in Greek philosophy. But some of these ideas will be made a little bit more clear as we go into talking about the different kinds of syllogisms and the limits of the terms in the syllogisms. How bounded are they? How maybe rational are they? How stable are they? We'll be talking about what they can be seen to include or exclude. And so for something to be very well known, to be capable of kind of full knowledge, we need to know clearly what that thing includes, what it excludes. So this will become a little bit more clear. It's a bit difficult just because we're talking about ancient philosophy, which either is something you know a lot about, or maybe it's just kind of some very basic things about it. So I'm going to stop here, and then in the next video, we're going to get into syllogisms. All right, that's all for now.